time right now. Some of you are probably preferring to watch the inauguration, but we appreciate you joining us, and we hope we bring you some valuable information. We're going to start at the top of the hour by doing a brief introduction. Myself, Karen Davila, and Dean Viskovich, and we will tell you a little bit about us. Then we'll go through just some background information on this vaccine, what it's approved for, whether there's any concerns with that, how it's being distributed and issues associated with that, and then eligibility and how the eligibility is continually changing. We'll talk a little bit about whether you should have the mandatory vaccine policy, and then go into the details about how you would implement that. And then lastly, we'll talk a little bit about potential adverse reactions and what the consequences of those might be, because I think people are concerned about that as well. So, Dean, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Hi guys, Dean Viskovich here. Thanks, Karen, very much. We're excited to talk about this. I know a lot of people have a lot of questions with respect to what's going on. Basically, my background is for probably close to 20 years. I was an insurance company trial attorney, representing the carriers in claims against plaintiffs for property damage, for personal injury, and a myriad of things. And basically, how I always approached a trial was becoming an SME, a subject matter expert in the for the issues that the case was. If it was a liability case that happened to be about a premises liability, I needed to know the rise and run, the coefficient of friction, all of those things. So when I'm deposing or speaking to an expert in premises liability, I know what I'm talking about. Now on the damages aspect, if you're talking to an orthopedist, a neurologist, a neuroradiologist about an MRI, and there's a herniated disc, and is it a bulge, or is it herniation, is it pressing on something, you kind of have to become an SME on all those type of things. So once I transitioned from out of the trial space into the healthcare space, I wound up spending a lot of time in private and public entities with healthcare companies that were basically lab driven. So I have been either general counsel and or chief compliance officer for public or privately held healthcare entities with a specific emphasis on labs. I've spent a lot of time in the toxicology space, pharmacogenomics, cancer genomics, the basic blood, chemistry, hematology, as well as a lot of infectious disease as well, and specifically the respiratory pathogen panels, which wound up including COVID, as COVID was added to those the basic respiratory pathogen panels. So that's how I wound up here, and that's basically a short synopsis of my background, how I am now trying to give us to add something with respect to the COVID-19 vaccinations, with respect to policies, procedures, and some risks, and some input as to what we all should be doing going forward.
Awesome. Thanks, Dean. Well, as I said at the top, I'm Karen Davila. I have been in the healthcare industry for almost all my career. I've been a consultant, I've been an operator, and I've been general counsel and chief compliance officer for a whole host of organizations, including large health systems, and then individual hospital settings, including various physician practices and so forth. So with that, I'd like to kind of start off with a discussion about what this vaccine is. So, Dean, we've all heard that this vaccine was approved by the FDA for emergency use authorization. Sounds kind of scary. People seem to be worried about that. But what really is that, and do they need to be worried?
The answer is no. Obviously, we're talking about the EUA. You see it everywhere. The FDA, EUA, they're like married. You see them together so much with respect to what's been going on in COVID since March. The emergency use authorization has been in place for I don't know how long with respect to the FDA and how they approve certain drugs. There's a process that needs to be conducted, completed, and undertaken. That certainly is the case with respect to the COVID vaccine. The EUA doesn't eliminate any steps in the process. It would consolidate them. They're certainly being done obviously quicker than anybody anticipated, but obviously based upon Operation Warp Speed and everything, this has been an all hands on deck approach. So as far as the significance of the EUA versus the regulatory process, I don't think that's an issue going forward. And I also don't think it's a defense to somebody who says that they have a concern about taking the vaccine because it's an EUA approved situation. So we'll get into that, and you can jump in now.
Excellent. Well, the other thing I thought we should just talk about a little bit is the distribution or supply chain for this, because it does seem to be in the news quite a bit these days. What with organizations trying to get it outside of the closed distribution that was set up. And so maybe you could tell us a little bit about what the distribution cycle is, and then also we can maybe just talk about caution that needs to be exercised in obtaining the vaccine.
You want the good news or the bad news?
Why don't you share? Let's start with the good news.
Well, the good news is there is a distribution logistic chain. The bad news, it's basically through the federal government and the state government, and then it is provided to each individual local municipality in the state of Florida. We have 67 counties, so it's going through the counties.
So I can't go out and buy it from Pfizer or Moderna?
You cannot. Matter of fact, if you read yesterday's newspaper, Governor Cuomo in the state of New York can't either. Okay, so here's the bottom line, guys. It goes directly from, we've got two manufacturers that have EUA approval, Moderna and Pfizer. It goes from the manufacturer directly to the federal government, and from the federal government, it goes to the states, and the states are distributing it through their supply chain. If you're looking for speed, flexibility, thinking outside the box, all those things are the exact opposite of what we expect from the bureaucracies that are in place and firmly entrenched in the federal and the state government, and that's clearly the situation that we are currently dealing with now with respect to the distribution of the vaccine. So
how about this? What if somebody's got some excess supply in New York and they want to get it down to Florida?
Why are you bringing up New York? She's probably making fun of my accent, number two. She's probably knows somebody in New York. It always starts in New York where somebody's got something that they're trying to sell to somebody, and they're trying to be a little more creative than the other individuals, I'm guessing. I'm teasing to a degree because Karen and I have been working together on the exact situations that we're talking about. The supply distribution chain is pretty static and rigid, and I think that's an understatement. It goes from the manufacturer to the federal government, to the states, and then the state, I know in Florida, it goes through the state of Florida Department of Health. Matter of fact, I can show you that we have agreements that are entered into between the Department of Health for the state of Florida and the ultimate organization that is provided with the vaccine. To go outside of that chain, when we talk about flexibility and trying to get into shot in somebody's arm, I know we all like to do that. However, being in the space that we're in, giving legal advice and applying the law to the facts, basically that's our job. Getting it from somebody who knows somebody may not be the best idea going forward. Karen could definitely give us the situation that she has been working on and what she has found with respect to the distribution chain.
Well, one thing was clear, was the Department of Health in Florida wasn't anticipating that inquiry. And so a private transaction to move this vaccine is probably not going to be approved in any scenario in the near future. Although it appears the CDC has contemplated the redistribution because they have issued a document, which is a CDC redistribution agreement that contemplates certain circumstances in which redistribution of vaccine would be allowed, but it suggests that it would require the approvals of the jurisdictions involved, which in the case of our scenario would be New York and Florida, and clearly those locations, the departments of health there would have to approve this. And keep in mind that since the allocations are on a state-by-state basis, trying to transfer that from one state where it was allocated to another state where it was not allocated proves even more challenging. And of course, there are a whole host of other issues. So the caution is, if you are interested in obtaining vaccine, work through your local county health department.
Yeah. In yesterday's news, if you looked at it, I know both the states of Michigan and New York were trying to contact Moderna and or Pfizer directly to get the vaccine for their state. And I know that it's my understanding that HHS, is it, has weighed in and said, a nice try, absolutely not. What they said, I think, is that they have to approve it.
Yeah. And so their approval of it, we don't know what they're going to say. But there's also some law enforcement in radar going on. This is definitely on the radar.
There are, well, depending on how you obtain the vaccine, there are, I know there's a criminal case pending in New York with respect to the distribution of a COVID vaccine from a healthcare entity from one location to the other, and the big concern is, where did you get this? You are on our approved supply list. So that's literally a criminal undertaking.
It's a perfect example.
Yeah, so we have to be careful, guys. So let's err on the side of caution. If you know a guy who knows a guy, probably out of New York, pump the brake on that for a little bit.
You didn't have to say that. I'm from Chicago. Could have been Chicago, because in Chicago it's the same.
Yeah, well, exactly.
So now, the other thing we've heard a lot about lately is eligibility. So who's able to get this right now? Because, we keep hearing, well, anybody with a comorbidity, an underlying risk condition, and clearly most of us could qualify for that. So tell us a little bit about the eligibility criteria that Florida is using currently.
Well, it starts from the CDC. But if you read anything from the CDC, it talks about a recommendation, okay? It basically says these are the recommended phases or the group or class of individuals that should be first. And the first one, obviously, was individuals in assisted living facilities as well as the hospital frontline workers.
So long-term care.
Correct.
And healthcare providers.
All right.
Awesome.
So that obviously, it makes sense. We're still in that stage now, okay? However, that CDC guideline, being here in Florida, the governor did not follow the CDC guideline. He went with anybody 65 and above, in addition to those entities or individuals that Karen mentioned as well. So it's a little broader brush. We obviously have quite a bit of an elderly population here in Florida, and the concern is, let's get that into the nursing homes, the assisted living facilities, plus the general public who's anybody over 65 at this point in time.
Excellent. So if I have an underlying condition, and let's say it's heart or diabetes, for example, two of the most common, heart condition or diabetes, can I get that now if I'm under 65?
That's a good question. Well, here's the situation. Currently, the people in phase 1 still aren't getting it.
Exactly.
Okay, so we're at the line, and if you're in Florida and you're at Publix and you're at the deli counter on Saturday morning, and there's a long line in front of you, times that by 1 million, and that's what we're currently undertaking now with respect to, we talk about this is basic supply and demand, and the logistics of getting it to the individuals who need it. It's not happening certainly as quickly as it could be or it should be. But when I talk about being nimble and flexible and responsive, and we're talking about the state and the feds, it's not where it's at.
So in Florida, the latest news is, as of yesterday, early yesterday morning, there was an announcement that Publix is now another partner in the delivery of this vaccine to the public. So if you qualify in one of the categories, over 65, you're a resident of a long-term care facility or a healthcare provider, you can get your vaccine. The public's outlet is primarily for those in the general population who are over 65, because those who are healthcare workers at long-term care facilities, care providers, or the residents there, they're going to receive their vaccine through the distribution that goes directly to that community.
Yeah.
So,
and what they're probably going to do is take the ticket machine from the deli counter, bring it over to the pharmacy. Brilliant.
Interesting approaches. Good. So let's talk a little bit now about a vaccine policy. So I published a couple of articles on the Florida Healthcare Law Firm website recently.
They're awesome. They're really good.
You.
They're really very informative and extremely informative, very thorough.
Thank you. And they're on the topic of mandating a flu vaccine. And so I guess the question you first have to ask, does your organization need a mandated flu vaccine? And I would ask probably a couple of threshold questions. Are your employees in direct contact with clients or customers or patients? Is that contact prolonged? And is it primarily in indoor spaces where there's not a lot of air circulation? If one or more of the employees becomes ill, does it jeopardize the continuity of your business? And I say that because if you're a small business, let's say you're a small medical practice, you have a couple of employees. If one gets sick, are you able to continue to operate your practice? And obviously that's very important. So if you answer yes to any of those, I would say you could certainly adopt a mandatory flu vaccine policy. And then when you get to the question of a COVID vaccine mandatory policy, you can absolutely do it. Early on, there was discussion that it was not recommended to mandate because it was only approved under the EUA by the FDA. But clearly that is not the case. The EEOC has issued its own guidance saying you can, under certain circumstances, and if you follow certain rules, adopt a mandatory vaccine policy. So what does that look like, and how do you implement that?
Let me jump in here. Guys, one thing we always need to do is let's continue to use our common sense and logic. Karen, you've been general counsel in a hospital space. Mm-hmm. And what have the hospitals been requiring for years with respect to vaccines for their frontline workers, and not only the frontline workers, everybody in the hospital space?
That's a great comment, because this is not new. So although the coronavirus is new, mandatory vaccines are not. Mandatory vaccines for flu and mandatory other immunizations have been mandatory for a long time in healthcare settings, primarily hospitals. So the notion of adopting a mandatory vaccine policy makes perfect sense if you're in an environment where your employees are at risk of contracting a serious illness or are at risk of exposing your patients or residents to those same illnesses if they become ill. So once you've decided that you need a mandatory vaccine policy, you'll need to develop the policy, and then you'll need to develop the policy for the exceptions. And so
that's huge, guys. If you are a healthcare entity, organization, employer, what Karen is talking about now with respect to implementing a policy and procedure with respect to the administration and distribution of the COVID vaccine is paramount, in my opinion.
Yes, and we'll get towards the end about, we'll talk some questions about the fears or anxieties of people who are declining to get it, and what can be done about that, and potential for adverse reactions. But for now, let's talk about, if you've mandated it, you have to deal with two potential exceptions. And each exception is handled a little bit differently. So the first exception is an exception under the ADA. And if an employee qualifies for an exception under the ADA, the employer has a duty to engage in an interactive process to determine an appropriate accommodation, if such an accommodation can be made without undue hardship to the employer. So let's unpack that a bit. First of all, if an employer has implemented a mandatory vaccine, there should also be a form for an employee to request an accommodation. That form should require the employee to provide adequate documentation of the existence of a disability under the ADA. Once that occurs, then the interactive process, which is a process to discuss what could be done to accommodate this to allow the individual to continue to work. This prevents the discrimination against individuals with disabilities if an accommodation can be made. In the case of the COVID vaccine or flu vaccine, for example, one of the most common accommodations is wearing of facial covering. Although it's not 100% protective, it is one of the ways that is used to eliminate the risk if an individual is unable to receive the vaccine. Just a point about disabilities. You don't have to, immediately accept the exact nature of that disability. You can ask certain questions and drill further into what that disability is and how it impairs the individual's ability to receive the vaccine. So other examples, in the case of COVID, you could have them wear face covering as well as a face shield. You could even, if they are not required to be on site, remote work options are certainly, very common in this case. Under the second type of accommodation you'd have to make would be if the person is declining the vaccine because they have a sincerely held religious belief. Excuse me. And if they have a sincerely held religious belief, the threshold is much higher for them. They have to demonstrate that this is truly a sincerely held religious belief. And even if they have that, because the expression of religion in the workplace is not without its limits, and Title VII doesn't give, unfettered rights in that regard, the employer has the right to evaluate whether the expression of religion disrupts the work or negatively impacts operations. And if so, then the employer is not obliged to provide an accommodation. But where an accommodation can be provided, again, it is only an accommodation up to the point that, only required up to the point that it isn't an undue hardship. In at least one reported case in a healthcare setting, a court did find that a religious accommodation and exemption from a mandatory flu vaccine would pose an undue hardship, and the term was used more than a de minimis burden, by putting the health of the vulnerable patients at risk. And so you can see that's even a stronger argument here, particularly with the virulent nature of this COVID virus.
The bottom line, there's two exceptions. And that's going to be one, the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, where the employer may have to make a reasonable accommodation if it's confirmed that there's a disability with that employee. And the other one is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which contains the religious exception, which is even more difficult than the ADA exception, guys. So those are the two things that Karen's been talking about. Can you give us an example of the religious one? I know with what
I'll give you a couple examples. One, so we hear a lot about people who are declining the vaccine for personal belief,
yes,
not necessarily
exactly.
religious belief. Either a belief that it contains a product from a conception, such as fetal tissue,
correct. That
or
was exactly
it contains certain products that they claim they're allergic to,
or they're not kosher or something like that,
or not kosher and whatever. And so one of the things you have to know is what vaccine you have and whether it has those. for purposes of the COVID vaccines,
It doesn't exist.
though neither of the current versions of this vaccine that have been approved contain any of the products that are objectionable. No fetal tissue, no stem cell,
Nothing.
no
mRNA, it's RNA.
Right.
As they say in New York, that dog don't hunt, I'm guessing. And it's a nice try, but unfortunately, like I said, guys, the overall question or the first issue we're talking about is, can it be mandated? Can you mandate to give this vaccine to your employees?
The answer is yes.
And the answer is yes. And to me, a lot of employers, a lot of employees are surprised with respect to that. It goes back to I don't want to get all legal on this, but we kind of have to. There's a 1905 Supreme Court case. It's called Jacobson versus the state of Massachusetts, where it said the state can mandate a vaccine during a pandemic. So it's been a long-held tradition. Karen could give you more information with respect to, we talk about EEOC, we talk about OSHA, we could also talk about the Florida Department of Health and where all they come in. If you want to shed a little more light on that, for the most part, it's our understanding that they would prefer not to mandate it. We would prefer that everyone voluntarily undertake the vaccine. But ultimately, when push comes to shove, the EEOC, OSHA, and certainly the state of Florida Department of Health can mandate you being required to take the COVID-19 vaccine. And then I'll let Karen jump in on that.
That is true. I mean, I think the ideal situation is that everybody voluntarily receives it for the health and safety of themselves and those around them, including patients they're treating. But where it is necessary, and I would say the risk is compounded when you have particularly vulnerable patients, and where you have particularly vulnerable employees, and so it's very important that individuals who are at high risk are receiving this vaccine. But there is a process, by the way, if they decline a vaccine.
Correct.
What if they don't make it mandatory, and you're offering it, and they don't want to receive it? What should an employer do in that case?
Good question. We have come up with a form and when we go back to the policy and procedures, that also needs to be contained in the healthcare entities' policies and procedures with respect to individuals opting out. They do not have, other than the reasonable accommodation of the ADA or the religiously held belief, opt out. Those are the only two legal reasons why they can. If you do not...
If you have a mandatory vaccine.
Correct.
But if you don't have a mandatory vaccine and they want to opt out, would you still recommend you get them to sign a release saying that the vaccine was offered?
No question.
Yes.
No question about it, guys, because if you think of the situations that could arise in the future with respect to how contagious the virus is, and especially when we're talking in healthcare and we're front-facing entities, going down the route of having those employees be at risk, you need to be aware of that. So
now we've talked about developing a policy. We've talked about having an exceptions process. That exceptions process requires you to develop a form. And again, quite frankly, if you have a mandatory policy, it will require the development of the exceptions process and the exceptions process form. But if you don't mandate it and you still have a policy that says we're going to offer the vaccine, and if the individual declines it, we're going to have them sign something, then you'll need to develop a release. So either way, you need some forms and policies, all of which need to be built out. And of course, we're always glad to help you with that if you need that help. Any other thoughts around?
The bottom line is, we are this is a bit of the wild, wild west. This is cutting edge. But once you come to some of these situations and decisions, documentation is going to be important to kind of protect you, okay? So when we talk about policies and procedures that are in writing that should be disseminated to the entire staff,
Well, and even at the top of it, it needs to say what their rationale for deciding that it's mandatory and they're setting this. So
no
I mean,
question.
to that point, yeah.
And even making sure that we have attestations signed by all the employees that they're aware of the policy, that they have read the policy, that they have opted out of the policy, all of those types of things. And that you need to coordinate between legal, compliance, and HR. It's really important. We can't be all in our own silo here. It's just not going to work. It's more of an all hands on deck approach to do what's best for your entity.
And we did say we could do a mandatory policy, and so it's important to know that you can mandate it as a condition of employment.
You can.
As well as mandated as a condition of continued employment. So again, subject to the exceptions we discussed. So if you're looking at a new employee or a prospective employee and the individual is aware of the mandatory policy, they're still entitled to employment and an opportunity to obtain an exception because of a disability or sincerely held religious belief. Dean, you talked about documentation. Documentation of the interactive process that you engage in when you're discussing an accommodation is also critical, because that documentation is what you'll rely upon if the employee chooses to bring some action because they claim you discriminated against them on the basis of their sincerely held religious belief or disability. So again, a lot of this is, being very careful and intentional about policies, about documentation, and so forth.
Perfect.
Awesome. So now let's talk about, so you've got this mandatory policy, and you're already up and running with your interactive process for exceptions. You've got all your forms. You've got people who have occasionally declined to receive the vaccine because of those, and you've got a team that knows how to handle those exceptions. But you've got some folks who have received the vaccine, and that's obviously the objective of this mandatory policy, is to get the vast majority of our employees vaccinated. So what happens if, and there always is the possibility of an adverse effect, an adverse reaction to a vaccine or a drug. It's always a possibility, albeit remote. So what happens if there is an adverse reaction in the case of the COVID vaccine?
Well, that's a good question. Let me start off by saying the biggest question that I have dealt with through employers with respect to the COVID vaccine is, what am I liable for? What happens? Okay? And how do I best protect the entity if something does occur? And we're talking about what happens if a employee has an adverse reaction to a COVID vaccine that they're taking for the benefit of their employer. The first hurdle that comes to that needs to be discussed is with respect to, is it workers' compensation? And for the most part, the answer is yes. Obviously, workers' compensation is the remedy that an employee is going to seek for any medical and or economic loss that they may occur as a result of an injury that occurs during the course and scope of their employment. The best bet to make sure that you have that workers' compensation immunity, as it's called, for a claim by an employee against an employer is, number one, you should be giving the vaccine to the employee during the course of scope of their employment, and it should not be billed to the employee's carrier. Obviously, based upon the federal rules and regs, there's no charge for this vaccine. That's why it's going from the federal to the state to the local entities, because there basically is no charge for the vaccine. Moderna and Pfizer are submitting the bill directly to the federal government. Okay, so that's one of the main or basic tenets that we should all be aware of. So it's going to be a work comp claim. Yeah, for the most part, yes. However, is there an exception to the workers' comp claim? Yes, it depends on the level of conduct of the employee. It has to rise almost to the level of an intentional act, reckless, wanton disregard for the health of the employee. So that's a concern when we're talking about an employer being protected or immune through a claim, and we're going to do that through the workers' comp immunity sections. That's state law. We also have a federal law. It's called the Pratt Act. Okay, the Pratt Act is the Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act, which includes those individuals that administer vaccines. Okay, the act grants liability immunity to entities against a claim of loss caused by arising out of, relating from the distribution or administration of the vaccine. So there's another federal protection that may be applicable that the healthcare employer should be aware of. And then these are things that Karen and I have both discussed in the past. So there's two levels of basic protection. One is on the federal side for the PrEP Act, and the other is basically your state workers' compensation laws. So those are the two things that you both need to be made aware of. For the PrEP Act, you have to have authorization from the federal or state or local authority in connection with the activity, and based upon the fact that the supply chain is directly from the feds through the Department of Health. You're well within the intent of the PrEP Act, in our opinion.
Yes. So, very interesting. I do want to go back. I thought of something, and I don't want to go off this topic if you have anything more to say on it, but I wanted to go back to when we were talking about the process in accommodations. One of the things I failed to mention is when you're engaged in the interactive process and you conclude that there is no accommodation that wouldn't be an undue hardship for you as an organization, you can't just immediately assume you can fire or not hire an individual. What you then have to evaluate is the next level of question, which is, are they covered by any protected leave? And so there are two types of leave that could potentially cover them, at least at the federal, and there may be in some states different protections. But the Family Medical Leave Act, FMLA, is the classic. That's the one we're most familiar with. 12 weeks in any given calendar year. 12 weeks, I think, yeah. I had a brain freeze. But the other one is the Family's First Coronavirus Act, which provides protected leave for individuals. And so if they're eligible for one of those, again, the outcome after an interactive process is not necessarily termination or not hiring, but it could be then that they're eligible for a type of leave. So what other thoughts do you have, Dean, about this whole process?
The one area that we have yet to talk about is with respect to, we'll talk about the employer's potential immunity from liability. And the big issue when we're talking about this vaccine is transportation and storage.
Oh yes, thank you.
Okay, you need to bring us up to speed with some of the concerns that are out there with respect to the Pfizer and the Moderna. You have to remember, guys, this current vaccine is given in two stages. It's either 21 or 28 days that separate the first vaccine from the second as far as the manufacturer's recommendation for the dosages.
Yes, yes. And so you've all heard this, so it won't surprise you, but this is one of those vaccines that has the strangest cold chain requirements, including keeping at a very, very low temperature, requiring periodic re-icing with the dry ice in transit. And so how you store and maintain the vaccine while you have it is critical too to your potential liability. If you receive a supply of vaccine, you need to understand what your requirements are, and then you need to be very strict about how you manage that.
Yeah, there's no question, guys. The bottom line is you need to follow to the T the manufacturer's recommended guidelines with respect to storage and transportation. That's going to be huge, because here's why. If you are not in compliance with the manufacturer's rules and regs with respect to storage and transportation, that could be deemed you rising to that level of carelessness or recklessness or wanton that would make the workers' compensation immunity no longer applicable. So that's going to be a concern, and it's logistically it's going to be tough because you need to keep the vaccine for 21 or 28 days to give the follow-up dose to those individuals, because that's the manufacturer's recommendations. I know we've read a lot of things. It's probably going right now as we speak, considering we're kind of going up against the Super Bowl with respect to our webinar. I don't know who put us in this time slot, but we'll have to talk to the director or producer. The powers that be. We definitely we could have done a better job than that. But obviously, they're talking about giving as many vaccines as quickly as possible, with giving short shift to the fact that if you want to follow the science, and the science says you got to follow up with a vaccine in 21 or 28 days, to give it all and not have any left, and to hope that you're going to get an additional dose for everyone that has already been vaccinated once. I don't know if you want to take that leap in logic, to be honest with you.
You have to have a strong supply chain, and you have to have faith in it. And right now we're seeing disruptions in that supply chain.
And the other thing, and the concern is the Modernas and the Pfizers of the world said you need to give the second dose within this window. It says maybe 21 days. The numbers are it's within very hours of days to get that second dose. Yes. Otherwise, it's not going to be as effective as it should be. And I hate to go down that path, guys. If we're going to follow the science, let's follow to the T with respect to the recommend. If I'm sitting here and telling you to follow as closely as you can with respect to the storage and the transportation of this vaccine, don't you think you should be following to the T the recommendations with respect to how to administer the vaccine as well? This is not rocket science. I'm not coming down from the mountaintop with these tablets. We always default to, even though we're lawyers, we can't get around common sense and logic and to do what we basically have been advised to do by those entities.
So we've talked about the storage, and it's interesting, I didn't mention in my intro that I spent many years at Walmart as an attorney representing their healthcare businesses. And one of the things that pharmacies deal with routinely is managing the temperature requirements, and they have to have redundant systems to assure that the temperature doesn't deviate from what's required, or else they have to destroy the supply that they have. And so how you manage that supply in your office, you're going to need to have a system that will alert you if there is a temperature variation from the manufacturer's recommendations. And I can't think of the term for it, but there is a term in pharmacy where the temperature deviates. There's a...
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's insane. In the lab space, we do the same thing. We talk about transportation validation studies. We talk about all the storage, all the validations that we need to be in compliance with all the CLIA and the CAP and the COLA rules and regulations with respect to how we store all our specimens as well. It's no different. Right. That's how those processes are audited and they're monitored on a regular basis. That's part of what I always do when I implement an OIG comprehensive compliance program for these labs and for all these other healthcare entities. The auditing and the monitoring process, the education and training process, those elements are by far the most important, and those are the things that stick out to me with respect to everything with regard to the COVID vaccine.
So back to where this conversation started, it was having policies to manage the receipt, storage, and use of vaccine in accordance with the manufacturer's recommendations. And I suspect, for the most part, most physician practices won't have the storage capability in existence, and so determining how you're going to do that is going to be critical, because our normal refrigerator will not store it for any period of time.
No question. You could look, I've already spent time on the manufacturer's website, and if you read Pfizer and Moderna, they will tell you about their storage. They have the dry ice. They have recommendations of, I think it's a 15-day period. They literally have the policies and procedures in place with respect to transportation and storage of these vaccines. Those are the types of things that your healthcare entity needs to be aware of, needs to implement, and needs to document with respect to this whole process.
Yeah, a couple other things I just thought of, and maybe, as we look at concluding here.
Sure.
If you intend to be a distributor, if you intend to give vaccines, you will need to get registered to receive those vaccines through your local Department of Health. So that's one thing. And if you are not already administering vaccines currently, you'll need to register for the Florida SHOTS, SHOTS program. You can Google that and go right to the site. And within the SHOTS program, they've activated a COVID vaccine administration portal where you can register for that. When you do decide you're going to administer vaccines in your location, you will be required to report those vaccines. And so to our point earlier about where you got your supply, it's going to be critical to be able to answer to that. So anything else you can think of?
No, I think we have
Good.
done a pretty good comprehensive job and touch base on all the important issues. Like I said prior, guys, this is really cutting edge stuff. I refer to the Wild Wild West. So there's going to be situations, there's going to be issues, there's going to be factual circumstances that are going to come up that you may need some input from us. We'd be more than happy to provide that to you. You know where to find us. It's been a pleasure to spend this time with you, and stay safe.
Well, again, thank you so much. We are delighted to have the opportunity to present to you in this fashion. We are available to answer questions. Feel free to reach out to us through our website, and we'll be glad to reconnect with you at that time. Thank you so much for your time today and for spending it with us instead of watching the inauguration.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.